My name is Daniel Carter. I'm 59 years old now, retired after 33 years working for the city water department in Sandpoint, Idaho, and I never imagined the loudest sound I'd ever hear in retirement would be the cheers of my own neighbors as a bulldozer ripped through the back of an $800,000 lake house. People always ask if I enjoyed watching it happen, and I usually tell them the truth. I didn't enjoy the destruction nearly as much as I enjoyed watching arrogance finally meet reality. But if you had walked through our neighborhood a year before all that happened, you would have thought I was the last person who would ever end up in a property dispute. I wasn't wealthy, I wasn't looking for trouble, and I certainly wasn't interested in fighting with my neighbors. I was just the guy everyone waved at when they drove by. My grandfather bought our property back in 1972, long before expensive waterfront homes started replacing old fishing cabins around the lake. When he passed away, he left the place to my father, and when Dad passed in 2005, it became mine. Most people would have looked at the paperwork and focused on the house, but the part my grandfather always cared about wasn't the house at all. It was a narrow strip of land, about 15 feet wide, stretching from the neighborhood road all the way down to the public shoreline. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't landscaped, it wasn't worth much on paper, but it was the easiest way for families to reach the lake without driving all the way around the peninsula. My grandfather used to tell me, land means something because of what it lets people do. I didn't fully understand what he meant until years later. Every summer I'd watch kids carrying fishing poles, teenagers dragging kayaks, grandparents walking hand in hand, families pulling little wagons full of picnic supplies, all using that little path. 23 households depended on it, and I never charged anyone a dime because honestly, why would I? We were neighbors. Around here that used to mean something. If somebody's truck got stuck in the snow, you helped push. If somebody's roof leaked, people showed up with ladders. If someone's dog wandered off, everyone looked until they found it. Nobody kept score. That's how I grew up. That's how I thought the world worked. Then Evelyn Brooks moved in. Now, if you've ever lived in a neighborhood with an HOA, you've probably met someone like her. She wasn't loud because she had a loud voice. She was loud because she had money, titles, and the kind of confidence that comes from believing nobody would ever tell her no. She was the HOA president, a real estate attorney who specialized in land development, and her husband owned one of the largest construction companies in northern Idaho. Together, they were the kind of couple people smiled at during meetings and complained about the second they drove away. When they bought the vacant lot next to mine, everyone started talking about the mansion they planned to build. Huge windows facing the lake, private boat dock, heated patios, imported stone, the works. I remember walking over the first week construction started with a plate of homemade cookies my sister insisted I bring because she said it was the neighborly thing to do. Evelyn accepted them with a smile that somehow felt rehearsed, thanked me, and immediately started talking about property values and how her project would elevate the entire community. I laughed politely and wished her luck because I figured we simply came from different worlds. For months, the construction crews came and went. Concrete trucks rolled in before sunrise. Framing crews worked late into the evenings. It was noisy, but I didn't complain. Building a home takes time, and everyone deserves a chance to build their dream. Once or twice, I noticed temporary fencing sitting a little closer to my path than I remembered. But construction sites are messy. Equipment gets moved. Stakes get relocated. I figured everything would be corrected before the project finished. Looking back now, I realized that was probably the biggest mistake I made. I assumed everyone respected property lines the same way my family always had. Then one Saturday morning, I grabbed my fishing rod and headed toward the lake, only to stop halfway down the trail. There was fresh concrete where dirt had always been. Massive stone columns stood exactly where children used to ride their bikes. Part of Evelyn's new back patio stretched straight across my family's access strip like it had always belonged there. I just stood there for what felt like forever, staring at something my brain refused to accept. Maybe I was looking at it wrong. Maybe the survey markers had shifted. Maybe I was missing something obvious. Then, one of the contractors walked past me carrying lumber, looked at my face, hesitated for a second, and quietly said, "Sir, you should probably talk to the owner." That was the moment my stomach dropped, because deep down, I already knew this wasn't a construction mistake. It was the beginning of something much bigger. Daniel Carter stood there another minute before turning around and walking back home. Not because I was afraid of confrontation, but because 33 years working for the city had taught me something valuable. Never argue when you're angry. Gather facts first. My grandfather used to keep every document in an old green metal filing cabinet in the basement, and after all those years, I had never thrown any of it away. By lunchtime, I had survey maps spread across my dining room table, tax records stacked beside them, and the original warranty deed sitting under a reading lamp. The property description wasn't vague. It wasn't open to interpretation, and it certainly wasn't missing that strip leading to the lake, 15 feet wide, roughly 280 feet long, transferred through 3 generations of my family without interruption. I paid taxes on every square foot of it since inheriting the property, just to be absolutely certain. I called a licensed surveyor named Frank Morrison, an old friend I'd known for almost 20 years. Frank arrived 2 days later with GPS equipment that probably cost more than my pickup truck. He worked quietly for several hours, drove stakes into the ground, checked satellite coordinates twice, then finally walked over to me with that uncomfortable expression professionals wear when they know they're about to ruin someone's day. "Daniel," he sighed, "I checked it 3 different ways because I honestly thought I had to be wrong. But I wasn't." He pointed toward the enormous rear addition of Evelyn's nearly finished house. "About 12 feet of that foundation sits inside your property line." I didn't say anything right away. I just looked across the yard while workers continued installing expensive windows, completely unaware that the concrete underneath them belonged to someone else. Frank shook his head. "I've seen garages over the line, fences, retaining walls, but I've never seen somebody pour part of an entire house onto another owner's land." I thanked him, paid his invoice, and sat on my porch until sunset trying to understand how something this massive could happen. The strange part wasn't that the mistake existed. The strange part was that nobody had contacted me beforehand. No request for permission. No offer to buy the strip. No easement proposal. Nothing. 3 days later, my answer arrived in the mailbox. Except it wasn't the answer I expected. Inside was an official HOA envelope containing a neatly typed letter signed by Evelyn herself. It read, "The association appreciates your continued support of neighborhood improvements. Your contribution of the access corridor to enhance community beautification reflects the spirit of cooperation we value." I read that sentence 4 times before I started laughing, not because it was funny, but because it was so unbelievably arrogant that laughter was the only thing keeping my blood pressure under control. Contribution? Beautification? She wrote the letter as if I had donated my land voluntarily. There wasn't even a question mark anywhere in the document. She had simply declared that my property now served her project. My younger sister Lisa came over that evening for dinner, and after reading the letter, she stared at me with wide eyes. "Please tell me you're not letting this go." I shook my head slowly. "No, but I'm also not rushing into anything." She smiled because she knew exactly what that meant. Our father had always said patience wins arguments that anger loses. So instead of calling Evelyn, I kept digging. Old tax receipts, county records, archived permits. I even searched through decades of emails stored on an external hard drive I barely remembered owning. That's when everything changed. Buried inside a folder from 4 years earlier was an email exchange between Evelyn and me during an HOA discussion about maintaining the walking path after a storm. Her exact words read, "Thank you for continuing to let the neighborhood use your family's path. We know it's privately owned, and we appreciate your generosity." I must have read that sentence 10 times. There it was, written in black and white. Years before construction began, she openly acknowledged the land belonged to me. Suddenly, this wasn't negligence anymore. This wasn't confusion. Someone who knew exactly where the property line sat had chosen to ignore it. The next morning, I called attorney Robert Ellis, a quiet man with silver hair who specialized in real estate litigation. He spent nearly an hour reviewing everything without saying much. Finally, he leaned back in his chair, folded his hands, and asked one simple question. "Daniel, what outcome do you actually want?" I thought about it longer than he probably expected. Money wasn't really the issue. I wasn't trying to become rich. I wasn't interested in selling the land either, because once that access disappeared, 23 families would lose the easiest route to the public lake forever. "I want my property back," I answered. Robert nodded. "Good. That's the cleanest answer you could have given." He explained that the law was overwhelmingly on my side, but he also warned me that people with money often assume lawsuits are simply another business expense. Don't be surprised if she tries intimidation first. He wasn't wrong. 2 days later, my phone rang. Evelyn didn't bother saying hello. "Daniel, I heard you've been hiring surveyors." That's true. You're making a very expensive mistake. I looked out my kitchen window while she talked, watching a pair of neighborhood kids riding bicycles toward the blocked pathway before turning around in disappointment. Actually, I replied calmly, I think the expensive mistake has already been poured in concrete. She laughed, though there wasn't any humor in it. You don't seriously believe you'll stop this project? Read your email from 4 years ago, I said. Silence. Just a few seconds, but enough for me to notice. Then she recovered. That email has nothing to do with this situation. It proves you knew whose land you were building on. Her voice became colder. Be careful, Daniel. Court can be very expensive. So can demolition. I hung up before she could answer. That afternoon, I hired a fencing company. By the end of the week, an 8-foot steel security gate stood at the entrance to my property, anchored in concrete with an industrial chain lock thick enough to secure construction equipment. I installed 2 high-definition security cameras and a large reflective sign that read, Private property. No trespassing. Violators will be prosecuted. I hated putting it there. Honestly, I did. That path had never needed a gate in over 50 years because nobody had abused my family's trust before. But trust only works when both sides respect it. The first people affected weren't Evelyn or the HOA. They were my neighbors. Parents had to drive nearly 20 minutes around the highway to reach the same public boat launch that used to be 3 minutes away on foot. Elderly couples stopped taking evening walks by the water because the detour was too far. Kids asked why the shortcut suddenly disappeared. Every single person who came to ask me the same question received the same answer. I invited them onto my porch, showed them the survey, the deed, the tax records, and finally Evelyn's own email admitting she knew the land belonged to me. Nobody walked away angry at me. Not one. In fact, several apologized for assuming I'd closed the path out of spite. One retired teacher looked me straight in the eye and said, Daniel, don't you dare give in. If she gets away with this, she'll do it to somebody else. Meanwhile, Evelyn launched a completely different campaign. She filled a neighborhood Facebook page with emotional posts accusing me of holding the community hostage, claiming I cared more about a strip of dirt than about children and families. She never mentioned that her patio sat on my land. She never mentioned the survey. She never mentioned the email. She simply painted herself as the victim. I didn't argue with her online. I uploaded 4 documents: the deed, the license survey, 50 years of tax records, and a screenshot of the email where she thanked me for allowing everyone to use my private path. Then I closed my laptop and went outside to mow the lawn. By dinner time, my phone wouldn't stop buzzing. Friends were calling. Neighbors were texting. People I hadn't spoken to in years were sharing screenshots of local comments. The story spread far beyond our neighborhood. 3 days later, the county newspaper printed a headline that made everyone in town stop and stare at the front page. HOA president's luxury home built on neighbor's private property. Suddenly, the narrative changed overnight. And, for the first time since all this started, Evelyn Brooks realized she wasn't controlling the story anymore. Robert called me early the next morning, and I could hear something different in his voice before he even finished saying hello. Her attorney reached out, he said. They'd like to discuss settlement options. I smiled, not because I wanted revenge, but because it told me everything I needed to know. If they truly believed they were right, they would have marched straight into court. Instead, they were looking for a way out. 2 hours later, we were sitting across from Evelyn and her legal team in a conference room overlooking downtown. She looked exhausted, nothing like the confident HOA president who had threatened me over the phone a few weeks earlier. The polished smile was gone, replaced by someone who suddenly understood that expensive suits couldn't rewrite property records. Her attorney cleared his throat and slid a proposal across the table. They wanted to buy this strip of land for well above market value, reimburse my legal fees, rebuild a public walkway somewhere else, and include a confidentiality agreement so nobody discussed the dispute publicly again. Robert glanced at me but didn't say a word. He already knew my answer. I pushed the papers back across the table. No. Evelyn blinked. Daniel, be reasonable. I was reasonable for almost 20 years while my family let everyone use that path for free. People make mistakes. I looked directly at her. Pouring concrete is a mistake. Sending me a letter thanking me for donating my own land isn't. The room fell silent. She tried one last time. What if we increase the offer? I slowly shook my head. You never asked before you built. I'm not interested in negotiating after the fact. A week later, Robert filed the final legal notice demanding removal of every structure extending onto my property within 30 days or we would seek a court order requiring demolition. I honestly expected another round of legal threats, maybe delays, maybe appeals. Instead, something surprising happened. Their own engineering consultants confirmed that the rear addition couldn't simply be trimmed back. The entire luxury patio, support columns, exterior wall, and part of the foundation had to come out. The estimated demolition cost alone exceeded $60,000, and repairing the remaining structure would cost even more. 30 days passed. Then, on a cool Thursday morning, 3 large demolition trucks rolled into the neighborhood. I made myself a cup of coffee and sat quietly on my front porch. Before long, other neighbors started appearing. Someone brought folding chairs. One family carried a cooler with drinks. Kids whispered to each other while adults stood with crossed arms watching the crews unload heavy equipment. Nobody celebrated because someone's home was being damaged. They came because everyone understood they were watching something bigger than a construction project. They were watching consequences. The first excavator eased forward and pressed its bucket against the stone wall overlooking the lake. For just a second, nothing happened. Then, the wall cracked with a deep echo that rolled across the water. Marble shattered. Glass exploded inward. The beautiful rear patio that had been featured in local real estate advertisements disappeared piece by piece. Dust drifted into the morning sunlight while workers carefully dismantled what arrogance had built. Evelyn stood several yards away wearing dark sunglasses, even though the sky was overcast. She never looked toward me once. At one point, an older neighbor named Carl, a Vietnam veteran who had lived there longer than almost anyone, quietly muttered loud enough for the people around him to hear. Property lines don't care how rich you are. Nobody laughed. Nobody needed to. The sound of concrete breaking said enough. By late afternoon, the back section of the mansion was gone. Expensive landscaping had been ripped out. Luxury stonework stacked into dumpsters. And my family's 15-foot access strip was visible again for the first time in months. The next morning, I unlocked a steel gate before sunrise. I left it open and walked down the path toward the lake with a fishing rod over my shoulder, just like I had done hundreds of times before. About 20 minutes later, I heard bicycle tires behind me. 2 little boys from up the street came racing down the trail, stopped beside me, and one of them grinned. "Mr. Carter, the path's back." I smiled. "Yeah, buddy, it's back." That simple sentence meant more to me than any settlement check ever could. Life slowly returned to normal after that. Families used the path again. Evening walks came back. Kids fished from the shoreline. It felt like the neighborhood had taken a deep breath after holding it for months. 8 months later, Evelyn sold what remained of the house for hundreds of thousands less than she had invested. Not long after that, she resigned from the HOA and moved away. The association elected a new president, a retired school principal named Linda, who knocked on my door one Saturday carrying a fruit basket. She laughed awkwardly and handed me a handwritten card. Inside it said, "Thank you for reminding all of us that being a good neighbor starts with respecting someone else's property." I still have that card in my kitchen drawer. Looking back now, people sometimes ask if I regret refusing the money. Financially, I probably could have walked away with a bigger bank account. But every time I see children walking down that little path with fishing poles over their shoulders, I remember my grandfather's words. Land isn't important because of what it's worth. It's important because of what it allows people to do. If I had sold that strip under pressure, 23 families would have lost something they'd quietly shared for decades. And the lesson would have been that power beats principle. Instead, everyone in our neighborhood learned something different. No title, no expensive lawyer, no luxury home, and no HOA president stands above the law. So now I'd like to hear what you think. If you were sitting in my chair, would you have accepted the money and signed the land away? Or would you have insisted that every inch built on your property be removed, no matter how expensive it was? Share your thoughts down in the comments because I genuinely read them all. And if you enjoy stories where ordinary people stand their ground against those who believe rules only apply to everyone else, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you in the next story.